WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. This episode is a real special one for me because, as I've said many times, I'm new to the city. I moved up here last year. And being a black man, many will tell you in the community that Boston is just one of those cities that's like inherently racist. It's so racist, you know? And when I got the opportunity to work at WBUR, I had some hesitations because of that. But, you know, I did some research and I looked into it and I said, man, black people live here and there's a culture here, you know? And I know, you know, being black myself, black folks are not going to put themselves in danger where they don't need to, right? So, you know, I did some of that research and I made a decision, and here I am having the time of my life. And I will say one of the voices who I came across is this brother, Dart Adams. He is a Boston-based journalist, researcher, historian, author. He does it all. And one of the biggest things he does is he is such an ambassador for the city of Boston, the real city of Boston. So I wanted to have a conversation with Dart for other people who might be in a similar situation that I was in. You get a chance to move to Boston and you might have some hesitation. So, you know, I want to talk to you, Dart, about some things that people can use for information to feel better about the move here. Because I could tell you, you know, I'm having a good time. Nobody's spitting at me and throwing bananas at me and no crazy stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I want to kick off and ask you, you know, everywhere you go in America, there's racism, right?
Absolutely.
America's built on racism.
Mm-hmm.
Like, however, Boston's reputation as exceptionally racist seems really hard to shake. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Because Boston doesn't do anything to try to shake it. The biggest issue with Boston is Boston prides itself on being a very liberal, very progressive city. But most of the progress in the city is made by Black, Latino, and Asian folks who fought tooth and nail and dragged everybody over the finish line to get certain policies made, enacted, and done. And then white Boston pats itself on the back and congratulates itself for the work done by the people who are most affected by these issues. And it's a never-ending story. And also, like, if you talk about media or representation of Boston, Boston does nothing to change the image of it being this big white utopia, you know? It's a college town. There are over 50 colleges and universities packed into this city that's made up of 24, 25 different neighborhoods. Some bleed into each other. Some are as opposite from each other as you can imagine, which is crazy to think that happens simultaneously. But also, they're packed into this area, this small area that can fit inside the borough of Brooklyn in New York. And Boston does not go out of its way to change that image that it's a white city, doesn't highlight the different ethnicities and the people who contribute to Boston culture, doesn't go out of its way in any way, shape, or form to say we need to shine light on these different people and their contributions to the city and how they've changed the city over generations, you know, over 120 years. The Boston I grew up in versus the Boston I see represented in film and television are so far from each other. They're as far from each other as the Pink Floyd album Dark Side of the Moon and the actual Dark Side of the Moon.
So give me some examples of how the city doesn't highlight its communities of color.
Okay, so when I think Boston, I think Black folks, I think Latinos, whether you're talking about Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, anybody from Central America, think about like East Africans, whether you're talking about Ethiopians, Eritreans. I think about everybody from the islands in the Caribbean. That is Boston. That is Boston encompassed. That's
There's
Boston's
so much
community.
black.
Yes.
The whole array of blackness.
Everybody's included. And again, when you grow up in the South End, Lower Roxbury, which is right next to Chinatown, my friend group was super diverse. And when we went to Boston Public Schools, we used to get a leaflet, a flyer. One side would be English, you flip it over, and there are like 7 different languages on the other side. And it represented all the kids that you saw in school, all your friends, you know? So when I think about my experience in Boston, all these different ethnic groups make up the culture of Boston that I grew up in. We experience all these different mixes and all this intermingling of culture that, you know, came into one thing, being that when you're from Boston and you live in this area, it morphs into something special, right?
Yeah.
You know, slang that never travels, like on dogs, on dead dogs, no sir. You know, so Boston has this distinct identity within its communities of color. And the only people that experience it are us. It never travels. And Boston is very glad of that, because it never gets out. So they get to perpetuate this myth of an all-white Boston that is, you know, something that, like, people outside of Boston love. They love the idea of the Pak Khan Harvard Boston accent. And as long as we've been talking, you've heard me speak. I live in the heart of Boston, born and raised. This is how a Bostonian sounds.
Why is it that these communities are not a part of the conversation? Like, you can't look at New York or Philadelphia and be like, oh, these are white cities. No,
you can't.
They'd look at you like you had two heads, right? But in Boston, that seems to be perfectly fine. But, like, why aren't these communities at the forefront more?
Well, I mean, you have to think about, like, collusion from other places. Like, for instance, New Edition blows up. New Edition, Roxbury through and through. Black Bostonians. There isn't a person on the planet who does not know New Edition. Doesn't know Ronnie, Bobby, Ricky, Mike, Ralph, right? But you can talk about New Edition and you'll hear, I didn't even know those guys were from Boston, even though they mentioned they're from Boston on each album. But people overlook that. And also, when you think about things like, you know, back in 1985, when they did the video for My Secret, the record label, which was based in L.A., wanted to sell these guys to a black music community, and they made them be in a video with the Lakers at the time, where they're all from Boston and they all live in Roxbury and they're all diehard Celtics fans.
Oof. I need to put that in context for folks. That's like your rival team. Super betrayal.
It's like up there with, like, you know, Red Sox, Yankees.
Yeah.
You know, the idea was, we have a black music department. We're trying to sell you to a black audience, and we're not going to do that by having you guys do a video in Boston with the Celtics.
And they have to abandon the black people
in Boston
at home.
Yeah. So,
you know
they
their
heard
own community. We'll be right back with more from Dart.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
A little while back, you took us on a tour of the South End.
Yeah.
You showed us where Martin Luther King used to live.
Yeah.
You showed us some of the lodging houses of the jazz musicians. You know, because we were walking down Massachusetts Avenue in the South End, and that used to be this strip of jazz clubs and restaurants and stuff, like a hub of black culture. The way you were describing it, it made the South End sound like Harlem. And this is something you do with newcomers pretty often, right? People who might be a little shaky on sending their family here, or some people who just want to know. Can you just talk about, like, why you feel it's important to take them on the tour there? And are there other places in the city that you could show them?
So the big reason why I do it there is because I know the feeling I got being a young person. Again, I was born in Boston City Hospital at the time, and I grew up blocks from Boston City Hospital on Mass Ave. And when I was a kid, that stretch was run down. It was not maintained by the city. Every third building was boarded up or abandoned. And When I was a kid, my elders would tell me stories about who used to be there, what used to be there, what that building used to be, all this stuff. Sammy Davis Jr. grew up in the same neighborhood you did. You know, Martin Luther King used to play basketball and hustle pool with people. And when I'm told these stories as a kid, I'm looking around this neighborhood. I'm like, if this was true, everybody would know about this. I'd see it in books. I'd see it in films. I'd see it in documentaries. Why do I take people from that station and walk them down this street and then walk them down the other street to my neighborhood now and tell them where everything was? Is because if you have this idea that there's no black people in Boston, like, that will change your entire perception.
So I love that, because what I'm hearing is this long tradition.
Yes.
Of passing down stories. Usually it's something you pass on to kids and stuff like that, but you're passing it on to people who just want to learn about the city. Tell me a couple favorite spots that you like to recommend to people who are new here.
All right, so if you're new here, I'd say visit Mita. I say go to Slade's. I say go to Daryl's Corner Kitchen. I'll send people to...
So it's Mita, Slade's, Daryl's Corner Bar and Kitchen.
Yeah, all right in the neighborhood. You know, Vejihantes, which is right in the neighborhood. There's so many spots that you could go to, man. Breakfast, people typically like go to Roxbury. They like to go to the Silver Slipper. You know, there's Charlie's right in the neighborhood if you want breakfast, you know. And it's funny because...
We're talking about South End and Roxbury.
South End and Lower Roxbury.
Which border each other.
Yeah. Again, the beauty of Boston is that when people think neighborhoods, they think of them as distinct, separate entities from each other.
Mm-hmm.
But they all bleed into each other. You walk down one street for 15 minutes, you're gone through them all.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. There's a lot here, a lot of cultural richness.
Mm.
And I understand you're a big advocate for signage.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the things that you pointed out to us during our tour was how small the sign for Martin Luther King was for his home, how small that sign was, and the fact that there was this little tree in front of it.
Mm.
What could the city do to be more welcoming to Black folks and to uplift its communities of color more? What could it do to dispel that myth of it being such a white city?
Well, it could actually put forth some effort to highlight them and do things that make it seem like they actually do care. For one of them, signage is important because if you go to certain places in the city, you'll see signs, but those signs were put up back in between 1979 and 1980 to celebrate the 350th anniversary of Boston. Again, Boston was founded in 1630. 1980 was the 350th anniversary of Boston. We're coming up on, the 400th anniversary in 2030. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that they did, they put up signs for just different places, but there were so many places that they just didn't get to everything. But now, with gentrification, it makes it all the more important that people aren't walking by the NAACP building office and not knowing that it was the NAACP building office. Mm-hmm. There needs to be signage on, and also I've taught the Berklee College of Music, right? Berklee College of Music is there because the place is built on jazz, and Boston was a jazz mecca. And you had all these jazz venues all up and down Mass Ave, and you have all these different establishments, and I'm like, there needs to be signage on every studio, every radio station, every venue. So if you're a new student to Berklee College of Music, if you're a new student to Northeastern University, if you're a new student to any surrounding college or university, Boston University, Emerson, what have you, you need to be able to go on a tour of Boston and walk around and know the history and why you have all these alums, because they came here specifically to indulge in and immerse themselves in the culture of Boston.
So let me ask you this. As someone who is like a diehard ambassador for the city, how would you pitch it to someone, say, who's coming from New York or maybe LA or something, and they're having some hesitation about coming to Boston? What would be your elevator pitch?
I tell them the same way you get pissed off about tourists talking about what is or isn't in New York or LA is the same way we feel when people come to Boston and somebody from the city has to show them where everything is and what's what. There are folks from LA who hear, I ain't see any Black folks from LA. It was like, well, you went here. These are tourist areas. You have to go specifically here. You have to remember that you can't take this highway. Like, every time you come to a town, you have to listen to the locals. And what people do with Bostonians and Black Massachusetts folks and people in New England is they talk over us and they tell us about our cities and our towns and our regions like we don't exist. So that's basically, I would just break it down to you. The same way folks talk about what your city and your town is or isn't coming from outside when they don't know it like the back of their hand and they haven't lived it, listen to us when we tell you.
Understood. Well, Dart, man, we could sit in here all day, bro. Thank you so much for coming through.
No problem. That's what I'm here for.
That's journalist, author, historian, and researcher Dart Adams. And that's all for today. You can find us on Twitter at WBURTheCommon or by email at thecommon@WBUR.org. And as always, thanks so much for listening. I'm Daryl C. Murphy. I'll catch you tomorrow.